Excellent. Thank you for joining us for Capturing Your Audience Through Storytelling, a webinar hosted by IDEA, the International Diaspora Engagement Alliance, and Working Narratives. My name is Sarah Yousefnejad Gallagher, and I'm the Program Officer for IDEA. This webinar is part of our Capacity Development Series, and we're also a proud event, part of Global Partnerships Week this year. If you want to tweet about the webinar as we go, the hashtag is GPW2016. GPW as in Global Partnerships Week 2016. We're fortunate and excited to partner with a stellar organization like Working Narratives to bring this training to our members. One of the top needs we see among our networks is how to effectively talk about the work that you're doing and persuade others to join your efforts and support you. So this webinar is incredibly timely and relevant for our networks. Now I want to formally introduce Paul VanDeCarr, who is the Managing Director of Working Narratives, an organization that works to change the story on the big social issues of the day. Through arts and media, Working Narratives helps nonprofits communicate better about the work that they do. Paul has worked in such storytelling forms as documentary, film, oral history, and theater. And in this webinar, he's going to walk through a series of questions to evaluate and improve storytelling, like what do you want to achieve? Who are you trying to reach? What is the central struggle in your story? And how to get people to participate in the story. Paul's going to use real-world examples from some of our IDEA members to look at how we can better engage our constituencies through story. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul. Paul, welcome.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and thanks to everybody on the webinar for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. Sarah sent me a list of the participants as of a couple days ago, and it looks like such a fabulous network with people doing exciting work with diasporas around the world. So thanks for having me. As Sarah mentioned, I'm with Working Narratives. We work with movements, nonprofits, grassroots groups to tell great stories that inspire, activate, and enliven our democracy. I wish I had a picture of myself up here so you could at least have an image of me, but imagine who you like, the face that you like. Now, the poet Shelley said, perhaps a little bit self-servingly, that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world, that they're the people who make the world go round. Now, if you substitute storytellers for poets here, you have a pretty fair idea of what we at Working Narratives believe, which is that beneath all the traditional markers of social change, the court cases or the legislation that's passed or elections, is a sea of stories. These can be history or fever dreams or imaginings or science fiction, things about the stories about the future. But these are kind of what animate our politics in the first place. So you can tap into this sea of stories to do anything that the nonprofit groups do. So that includes raising money, imagining what a better future looks like, to rally public support, to build leadership, to frame issues, to have a good time. I think it's, we deal with a lot of serious issues, and you all deal with a lot of serious issues, but we can also enjoy the work that we do, and storytelling taps into that. And as I mentioned, use stories to tap into the passions that get people going in the first place. So this is why we use storytelling. Now, to my mind, data, sort of numbers and jargony language communicates the what. But again, stories get at the why we do the things we do at all. And that's the way we connect with people. Because people don't relate to issues, I believe, we relate to other people. In other words, their stories. So this is what we're getting into when we talk about storytelling. And finally, I just want to say that I think storytelling is a creative endeavor. And when we create stories, whether it's a piece of theater or a web video or a newspaper story, we stay hopeful and strong. And that is every bit as important to social change as are the more sort of discrete tactical matters of deciding on your audience or setting up a social media presence. I want to start off with what is maybe a bit of a boring, but I think very important topic, and that is your storytelling strategy. Many nonprofits ask me, how can we get our web videos to go viral, or how can we get our organization into the New York Times or the Chicago Tribune or some other big newspaper. And to my mind, those are okay questions, but they're putting the cart before the horse, if you will. When the real question should be, what do you want to achieve? Let me just advance the slide here. That, for me, is the very first question to ask when thinking about how to do good storytelling. So those groups that ask me those kinds of questions, how do we get into the New York Times, how do we get our video to go viral, they see the story as the end, but that is not, to my mind, the end. Maybe you want to raise money. Maybe you want to build a community of people in a diaspora. Maybe you want to change policy, let's say. So the first question is always what you want to achieve. And raising awareness, this is a bit of a bug of mine, I guess, is never an end goal. It's great if you want to raise awareness, but that's only an intermediate goal. People have to be aware of your organization or your issue before they take action on it. But that's only a step on the way to getting them to take action or to change their behavior. So that, again, that's the first question you ask in a storytelling strategy. The next question is, who can be a part of that effort? So if you want to change policy, maybe the people who are going to help you achieve that are legislators, or maybe it's aides to legislators, or maybe it's voters in a certain district. So you target your audiences, you find out exactly who your audiences are and who the people you're going to work with to achieve this thing. And then those are the people you're going to be telling stories with or to. Now, some groups, in fact, quite a few groups, talk about reaching a general public. And there is no such thing as a general public in storytelling strategy or in a communication strategy. Because if you're trying to aim at or target everybody in the world, your stories are going to be so general as to be pointless, essentially. So you want to target your audiences, and you're going to be telling different stories to each one of those target audiences. Now, the third question is, how do you reach those audiences? How do you reach those target audiences? Now, this graphic indicates a lot of social media channels, but you can reach your audiences or your base or your stakeholders through any number of means using stories. It could be street theater, it could be web videos, it could be a speaking tour of colleges or mosques or anything else. It could be op-eds in a newspaper, community newspaper. So, we asked, what do you want to achieve? Who's going to be part of that effort? And then how are you going to reach them? And then finally, the last question in a storytelling strategy is, what stories are you going to tell them, or what stories are you going to ask them to tell you to move them to be part of your effort? So that, again, that's the last question in a storytelling strategy, not the first, as many groups that approach working narratives ask. So with that in mind, I want to turn to the African Diaspora Network. A few groups submitted questions in advance about how they can use storytelling better. One of those was the African Diaspora Network. And I'm going to have, I guess it's Dan from the African Diaspora Network come on in a minute, but not quite yet. They asked about a few things. Excuse me. The African Diaspora Network recently had a very successful symposium just a little over a month ago called the African Diaspora Investment Symposium. And it's featured on their website, which is the homepage is very attractive and informative. You get an idea right off, for example, in the lower half of the page here, who they are and what they do. You know, there's people featured, you know what the mission of the organization is, and you get a sense from the top half of the page here that they had this big event recently, so there's fresh content. And one of the questions that ADN asked was, how do we develop new programs around the panel discussions that we had at the symposium? So if I could get Dan to come on for a second and just tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thanks, Dan.
Okay, great. Thank you for inviting me to share. So our event, we had, I would say, a very broad range of panel discussions. And some of the feedback that we received and that I also provided was that in future iterations of this event and other smaller events, we would want to have more targeted discussions. And you know, it's difficult when you do have a very broad audience and people from various sectors to decide how best to sort of structure your discussions and your events to get people engaged on a deeper level, if that makes sense, and just to not spread things so thin, maybe.
Yeah. Who are some of those, like who are maybe your top three audiences, and what are, let's say, you mentioned this or somebody mentioned this in writing, but if you could say kind of your top three audiences and your three topics, let's say, from the symposium.
The symposium specifically, well, some of the feedback, our audience for that was investment centric on one hand, but we also, from our earlier events and our earlier outreach, had some more nonprofit organizations and people that were on the philanthropic side. So there's sort of a push and pull between those two groups in terms of how we focus our future events.
Mm-hmm. So it's philanthropy and investment funds, if I'm getting you right?
Yeah. For-profit, nonprofit, and trying to sit somewhere in the middle so that we don't alienate either side.
It's a tricky balance. And how about the topics of, I think one of the questions that somebody from ADN had posed was how you harness the enthusiasm of the symposium to develop new programs around the panel discussions. Can you maybe just give me a couple of topics there of those panel discussions?
So, for instance, one of the panel discussions was about how to harness the diaspora expertise and enthusiasm and channel that into concrete programs back on the continent. And then we had another panel that was specific to bringing the diaspora together for for-profit investments in small enterprises in Africa. And then even another panel would be on the philanthropic side, solely on the philanthropic side for either health or education.
Okay. Health education, small enterprise. Congratulations on the event. I wish I could have been there. It sounds interesting. There's now, I will say, now I think partly because you're just giving this very short summary of the symposium, and partly because I wasn't there, and I haven't gotten a sense of who the people are behind the symposium and behind ADN and the people who are in the room, if you know what I mean. So, I think topics like investing in Africa, and I do some work with the UN Development Program, so there's a lot of similar language where it's talking about poverty writ large or investing in, countries and development writ large. And people lose sight of the individuals who are part of that process. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Now, I'm not sure if that's true with you, but I'm guessing, just guessing, that maybe at the symposium, the dialogue is very sort of policy centric and how to say, you're talking about investment. You're not necessarily telling stories. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah.
So I could talk with you more about this offline, but my inclination would be to say, if you invited stories from your members, or sort of if you knew a few people whose personal stories really addressed these topics, whether it's health and education, I think you said, and philanthropy, and or small enterprise, then tie those stories to the meetings. Tying those stories to the meetings would be more useful than just shopping around, let's say, short videos from the meetings themselves. I'm not sure if I'm getting quite at your question.
Honestly, I didn't write this question.
Right. But I'd be happy to talk with the group more on the phone later. I think, and then there was a question about, well, actually, maybe I can just, before I move on, I think one of the great assets of any group, such as ADN, is the stories of the people who are in it. Now, granted, another asset is the expertise, is the technical and investment expertise of the people who are in it, and you need that in order to do the work that you're doing. But the stories, again, that get at the why we do this work at all are a great asset as well. So I think ADN and other groups on this call can tap the stories of their members to make connections with investors and others. Let me just move on to the next slide. I think there was also a question from ADN about how do we raise awareness and funds for another symposium and other programs. And I think it sounds like ADN is quite far along with, you know about communication strategy. So I think I'm probably not telling you anything new here, but I would just, for purposes of the other groups on the call, say that refer back to this storytelling strategy that you always have to start with what you want to achieve, and then figure out what stories to tell and to whom. But Dan, I would love to talk with you or Serge later on the phone to go into more depth on this.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
All right. Let's move on to some of the bit more interesting stuff than or fun stuff than storytelling strategy, and that is the struggle. What is the central struggle of your organization, and therefore the stories that you're telling? Now, I've worked in nonprofits a long time, and it's easy over time to get wrapped up in the day-to-day, phone calling and emailing and writing grant proposals and web copy and everything else, just the minutia of daily work. We can forget about what brought us to this work in the first place, and the drama, I use that word cautiously, and the emotion behind what we're doing. So my question here is, what is the struggle your organization is participating in? What is the struggle in the stories that you tell? And I say here, people may love a winner, but they love a fighter even more. So we want to hear the stories of struggle. What are the difficulties you're facing? I just want to run over what I see as the basic principles in good storytelling. A story has to be about somebody or a community and members of that community. It can't be about an organization so much. It can be about the people in that organization, but it can't be about an organization. A protagonist cannot be a city or a country, exactly, but it can be about the people in that city. So there has to be a protagonist or a community of protagonists. So in this case, I have Superman here as an example. Superman has a background. He's an orphan kid from the planet Krypton. He's got personality, or there's something to him. He's not just, we come to learn that, there's more to him than just the cape and the super strength. So who's your protagonist? And then another important question is what is your protagonist up against? Now, if Superman, let's say, just were able to beat every opponent or villain easily all the time, there wouldn't be much of a story. There's no conflict, of course. So in Superman's case, he's up against, for one thing, Lex Luthor. This was from the 1980s movie version. He's got this super villain, right? And again, it wouldn't be very interesting if he could just beat villains like that, but he has weaknesses as well. So in his case, there's Krypton and the green stuff that he's holding in his hand there. Another weakness of his is Lois Lane, whom he's in love with. What are you up against, or what is your protagonist up against? And then the question is, how does your protagonist respond to that challenge? What do they do with the difficulty? In Superman's case, he fights back the supervillains, and he's caught between his love of Lois Lane and his desire to fight crime and do justice. And then finally, what happens? In the end, he realizes that it's got to be one or the other. It's either got to be Lois Lane or it's got to be fighting crime. And he decides to fight crime. And here he's about to kiss Lois and make her forget who he is, and have her sort of fall out of love with him. So any story, whether a nonprofit story or a Superman movie, has to have these basic ideas at play. Now, there can be a huge amount of variety, infinite amount of variety, really, within this structure. You've got to have a person, not an organization, who faces a challenge, and then who responds to that challenge, and then there's an ending. You want to give your audiences some kind of satisfaction. Something's got to happen, and these principles apply very, very broadly across cultures. I have done workshops just a little bit internationally, but mostly around the U.S., but with people from different cultures and languages. And these principles apply basically across the board. I'd be interested to hear if anybody has other principles, but we'll get to that later. And I think that, you know, any nonprofit story can have just as much drama and emotion as Superman does. Now, you may not like Superman, the Superman story, or the, you know, any particular movie version of it, but I think you still see my point that there is drama and emotion in the work that you do, and it's a matter of bringing that up. A few words before we get to the next questioner or the next idea member is about hooking your audience. You know, especially in today's world of social media and just trying to get people hooked in like the first 10 seconds of your video or whatever it might be, you do, especially online, want to hook your audience early. So the popular storytelling group, The Moth, gives some good advice. They say start in the action. So instead of saying, oh, I was thinking about climbing a mountain, you know, I had wanted to do this for a long time, and so forth and so on. Instead of saying that, start in the action. The mountain stood before me. So if you start in the action, that can help hook your audience. Second way to do this is to introduce questions and mysteries. The website Upworthy says, you may have seen it, they'll say, you won't believe what happens in minute 2 of this video, or you'll start crying by a minute and a half into this video, we guarantee you. Now, Upworthy is reviled partly for doing this so much, but they do introduce questions or mysteries into the minds of audiences. The playwright Chekhov said that if a gun is introduced in Act 1 of a play, it has to go off by Act 3. So in other words, if you introduce a question, your audience is going to remember that. They'll remember if you say that, oh, a gun happens to be there on the table. They're going to think, what's going to happen with that? And I think you'll notice this in any book you read or movie you see or TV show or whatever, any kind of story. There are questions that are posed and that are answered, and new questions come up and new mysteries are introduced. Finally, if you use intercutting and serial stories, that's another way of hooking your audience. You know, 1001 Nights or The Arabian Nights is perhaps the best example of a serial story where Scheherazade keeps herself alive night after night by telling stories and then not telling the end of them to the Sultan until the following night. So if you keep people interested by releasing stories in pieces, right? That's a good way of kind of keeping your audience engaged over time. And then finally, use photographs. Many groups, you know, will tweet without photos, and that's fine, or do blog posts without photos. But well, I think it's beyond a cliche at this point to say that pictures tell stories. But use photos, more of them. And with that, I want to move on to Humanity Helping Sudan, and I'll ask someone to come on in a minute if we have someone from Humanity Helping Sudan. They asked for sort of general messaging advice. I took a look at their website. So on the homepage here, this is the top half of the homepage. It doesn't answer the really critical questions like, who are you and why should I care? Now there's, you know, it's sort of a clean interface. There's not a lot going on. It's not too busy, which is good. But it's also, it just doesn't give me a lot of information. So for example, there's no photograph up at the top. There's the top of a photograph at the thing there, but you can't, you know, you see it's a bicycle helmet. So it's a little confusing. Like there's nothing to grab me. The print is small. So a website has to right off answer those questions. Who are you and why should I care? There has to be some sort of mystery or something to hook your audience, as I was just talking about. So what I would do, and this is just specific to your website, but hopefully the principles here will be useful to others. I would put in a tagline or a mission below the HHSP name, so we can get an idea of what you do. If you had some teaser content, again, as I was talking about hooking your audience early, if there are photos, if there's quotes, if there's a Twitter feed you can put on the right side of the page, a question, a short video right up top to draw people in. That would go a long way, I think. And then to make your navigation easier, there are something like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 buttons at the top there. And I noticed that, for example, in the photos section, there are a couple very outdated photos. And then the same thing with videos. Those are outdated. Maybe those could be compressed into one section on media or stories, better yet. And then in the, actually, let me just move on to the next section here. And then in the contact page, it doesn't give anybody's name, just says Director of HHSP. And then in the blog, there's mention of a recently hired staff member, and then there's the name of the director. But those, you have to kind of dig through the blog a little bit, not very much, but a little bit, to find out the names of the people who are involved. So right up front, especially on the contact page, I want to see photographs of staff. I want to see a little bio about who they are and why they care about Sudan. And then one other thing, I'll just go back one slide here. There's mention of the Lost Boys. It says Biking for Lost Boys. Now, there was a film, The Lost Boys of Sudan, in the U.S. I can't remember how many years ago that was, 5 or 10 years ago. So there's some awareness of who the Lost Boys of Sudan are. But for a website today in 2016, I would want to say, oh, those guys are still around? I mean, I think that's a question that a lot of people would be asking. So you want to have stories of Lost Boys today. Maybe it's a follow-up on either the film or just saying why the Lost Boys is still a relevant issue for your particular audiences. And I think, Sarah, you said there's nobody from Humanity Helping Sudan on the line, so we'll just move on.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see here. Excuse me. A question that some people had submitted in advance just by email, or the sign-up form, rather, is how you get people to participate using storytelling. So in other words, it's not just a question of you telling stories out into the world and then not being sure if they're ever going to make any difference. I'll mention a few things about this. One is that are you providing pathways to action for your audiences or for your stakeholders? So if that's a documentary film screening, do you have a table at in the lobby of the theater so people can learn more about the issue? Do you have a link at the end of a video so they can go to your website? So giving people concrete ways to get involved with your organization and your work is important. Also, do you have partners, partner organizations? So getting people involved in a story is not just a matter of telling really good stories. It's also of building partnerships with other organizations who will help you get those people involved. And ideally, you build those partnerships early on. So a group called Active Voice worked with a documentary film called Welcome to Shelbyville. It's about an immigrant welcoming program in small town Tennessee. There were many Somali immigrants coming in, and the existing population just did not know anything about Somalia. So Active Voice worked with immigrant welcoming organizations around the country to build an audience for this film fully 2 years before it even came out. In other words, so when they started making the film, they were already making partnerships with groups around the country who would be able to use the film when it was ready. So that's a whole lot better than if you just make a documentary film and then you say to groups like, hey, do you want to use this? If they haven't been involved and informed and invested in the project from the beginning, then they're less likely to want to use it. Now, this is a sort of outstanding example in that it's a documentary film and those take years to make and many thousands of dollars to make if you're going to make a professional one. But the principle still holds, whether it's a little speaking tour or a one-night event. If you get partners involved, then you're more likely to get people to participate. Also, there's the question of what kind of storytelling or what kind of stories you're telling and if they provide a sense of hope. If you leave people despairing that the problem that you're addressing is too big, or if you get them to feel that whatever they do is not enough, then there is no reason that they would get involved with your organization. Why would they? So if you can provide hope in your stories and a sense of efficacy, as I say here, you're more likely to get them involved. So a group called the Solutions Journalism Network urges people to tell not stories about who done it, but how done it. In other words, how are communities solving problems that they're facing? And with that, I want to turn to DeGuy. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. I think, Sarah, you said there's nobody from DeGuy on the line. Is that right?
Not that I recognize by name, yeah.
If anybody from that group is on the line, please give a holler in the text box. DeGuy wrote in and asked a couple of questions. So here on their homepage, they've got this beautiful slideshow. You see that main photograph up front of the woman that's one of the about 8 or 9 slides in a slideshow. There's lots of nice pictures, easy links to Facebook and Twitter and Pinterest. There's intriguing content about the Brazilian diaspora. So it's just a beautiful website. And they were asking about how they can use the stories that they've collected to better effect and to tell a story about their community. So here on this page, you'll see they have sort of a story bank, you might say, a bank of stories. They've got 23, actually more than 23 pages of stories, and each page has, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stories on it, I think actually more. So they've got a lot of stories. They've got easily over 100, probably in the hundreds of stories available, some video, some text. But so that's fantastic. They've got a great asset here in having all their members' stories. The thing is, it's hard to know, maybe even impossible to know a little bit where to start or why. So I'm not certain, but I'm guessing that the stories up on the first page here are the most recent ones. So we watch those. We're not sure why we're watching them or what they're about exactly until we see them, but we don't know if there's a theme or anything like that. So in order to tell a story about the community, you could do one of several things. You could organize stories by geography. Now they've got like a nice website, and you can use Google Maps to put pins on a map with clickable links to those stories. So that's one way to organize it. You could also organize stories by theme. You could have a word cloud with a list of topics or themes, so visitors can select groups of stories along that theme. You can also curate groups of stories on topics and write a blog post, and then link to those stories, or create sort of a story out of several of those other stories that you have here. A couple other questions that the guy asked, and then I'll wrap up and we can just open it up to questions. They asked if they should create a yearbook of their stories. I would return to the what I was saying earlier about storytelling strategy. Great, create a book, but only if it serves your organization's purposes. It's a little bit like an organization asking, how can we get into the New York Times? If the purpose of your organization or the mission demands that you put out a book and you can reach your audiences through a book, then great, but otherwise don't bother. And I'll just close up with them by saying, have fun. I think I watched some of the stories on the website, and I think if you want to get people involved in the organization, if you're having fun, then that's going to show in your events, it's going to show in your stories, and that people will connect you or associate your organization with good things. So that's that. I'll send the full slideshow. I have some other slides on here, but I'll make the full slideshow available for everybody afterwards. But I do want to leave time for questions. So I'll wrap up there. Does anybody have any questions about how they can use stories or any of the particular things that I said today?
We do have some. Do you want me to take a few questions from the audience now?
Yeah, sure.
Great.
And I can see a couple.
Yeah.
Go ahead, sir.
Sorry, there were a couple earlier. Let me just go through the first part. So one, this is sort of a question, but sort of for everyone on the line. One of the participants, Felicity, has suggested that maybe if there are people who are interested in creating a Facebook group or something like that, for you guys all to stay in touch and bounce ideas off each other, to talk about storytelling or other things, that if you're interested in something like that, send your email address to Felicity in the chat box, and she will organize that. I thought that's a great idea. We often get people on the webinars sort of networking and talking to each other in the chat box, but then after the webinar, it's harder for them to connect. So if you're interested in that, send your email address in the chat box there to Felicity. So one question for you, Paul, is from Amber. She asked about if you don't have a person that you can tell a story about when you have to write about an organization, what are your suggestions for that? So she was saying she does write donor stories, and that's an easy process. But when she has to write about partner organizations, that's when she has trouble. Can you give any advice on that piece?
Yeah, and maybe if we could have Amber come on in a second. I think there are many kinds of stories that an organization has. I think the kind that people most talk about is the people whom the organization benefits, so to speak, or the activists, or. But I think it's great to tell donor stories, actually. I mean, especially if, in going through a storytelling strategy, if one of the things you want to do is raise money, then stories about donors can help attract other donors. So I think it's 100% legitimate to tell donor stories if one thing you want to do is raise money. But actually, if Amber's still on the line, maybe she could come on and just say a bit more about what her organization does.
Yes, hi, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I work for Turkish Philanthropy Funds, and we're a nonprofit organization which focuses on gender equality and education. And we have 40 partners in Turkey that we're working together. And we use newsletters every month, and we get to talk about our partners in our newsletter. And that's where I have problems how to highlight those organizations, because it's not personal stories that I can really connect to. So that's the issue I'm having.
Yeah. So what are some of the partner groups? Like, what are they doing exactly?
It depends. We have 40 partners. Some of them focus on gender equality, women empowerment, education, social and economic development, health,
Uh-huh.
anything basically.
Yeah. And why is it so hard to connect with them for stories? Is it just that is it a logistical thing that,
It's
you know,
mostly
stories and
when
they
we
don't give
talk to
them,
them.
or?
When we talk to them, they tell us like general stories or what they do. They don't give us about they don't tell us where the money exactly goes, or we don't get to hear about the personal stories from them. So that's why I'm having difficulty connecting with those organizations. They just tell us where the money goes and what they do with it, and that's it.
Yeah. Huh. But there are certainly people involved. It's just that or there are people's stories, it sounds like, who they could tell. It's just that they're not telling them to you for one reason or another.
Kinda.
Yeah. Huh. Well, it's interesting. The Working Narratives works primarily with, I'll just illustrate this by point. Working Narratives works primarily with groups involved in prison issues in the United States. And sometimes it can be hard to get people to tell their stories because, sometimes they want to be anonymous. They don't want to tell their story about their son is in prison, and they think they might endanger, the family member who's in prison. They think they might get criticized on social media. So sometimes it can be hard to get stories for that reason. I guess I'm a little mystified as to why the groups aren't giving up their stories, other than that maybe they don't have an effective means themselves of collecting stories.
I think that's the issue. But the problem is that I still have to write something about them. So just because they don't have those kind of inspiring stories.
Yeah. Well, one other thought is, and there's actually a chapter in the Working Narratives Guide on how to get stories from stakeholders, so I'd direct you to that. But, I think if people don't have a very clear idea of what kind of stories you're looking for, it might seem like an overwhelming task. So you may already do this already, so pardon me if I'm telling you something you already know, but if you give people, like, let's say, 25 or 50 words on or more, describing exactly what you want. Like, we are looking for a photograph of someone your organization helped, and a 50-word caption about that person and how your organization helped them. So that's one way. So just giving very clear guidelines can help them narrow down the stories, And then in terms of means of collecting stories, again, if they don't have a system, then, that's one thing. Is there any way that you can reach their members directly?
I tried, actually. Let me give you an example. We have this organization in Turkey which focuses on women empowerment. They told us how they're trying to get women into the workforce and what kind of projects they're doing. But when I talk about those projects, it doesn't sound really personal because I'm talking about something really general. That's why I think I'm kind of losing my audience.
Oh, you still there? Sorry, your voice just went out.
Oh, okay. Should I talk?
Yeah. Well, so let me say just actually one more thing about this, and then we should probably move on to another question here. But sorry, I just lost my train of thought. I think if it might be helpful to let's say work with, I don't know, 3 organizations, 3 partners that you have, and say, I really want to get some stories, some good human stories, not general stuff about the organization's work. Can you help me? And then, so let's say you if you know the communications person or some other staff member at 3 different organizations and you trust them to be able to get a story, then get those 3 stories as examples, and then that can provide an example for other groups so that they kind of know what you're talking about when you ask for stories. Do you see what I'm saying? Like that they have a hardcore, or they have a very specific example of what you want?
Yeah, that's a good idea. Thank you.
Sure. And again, I would direct you, Working Narratives has this new guide on storytelling and social change. There are about 30-something chapters answering questions such as these. How do we get stories from our members? What makes a good story? How do I best use my time at an interview to get good stories? So, and there's a PDF of that guide. It's for free. There's also a magazine version where the chapters are all available. So you can just visit workingnarratives.org and look for the storytelling guide. Thanks for your question, Amber.
Thank you.
Is there anybody else?
Yeah. Do you think, since we're running a little short on time, we may not be able to call on everyone out loud, but I'll definitely read the stories that came in. The questions that came in. So there's one from Sandra. She says, how do you recommend using stories over the phone? So, for example, if you're cold calling, doing cold calls for fundraising, or she asked, would certain stories only work for certain donors? Do you have any advice on that?
Oh gosh, over the phone.
Maybe your advice is not the best venue for stories. That's possible too.
Yeah. That's funny. I think it would be really hard. I mean, given how little time a cold caller has to hook somebody on the phone, a story might be not the best way to do that. Some kind of complete story. Gosh, I'd have to think about that one. I'd actually like to ponder that and email you, Sandra. That's a great question. My inclination is to say, unless it's a very, very short story, that cold call might not be the best place for stories. And then, I'm sorry, the second part of that question was about.
So, for example, would stories only work for existing donors or a certain subset of donors?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think so. I think when you have, stories can be very short, granted, but yes, I would say better for existing donors, or at least maybe not better for existing donors, but better in venues where you have the chance to the time and the chance to actually tell a story. So that could be a fundraising letter. It could be a public event, like a big fundraiser that you have. If you have an annual fundraiser, let's say, and you get people to come up and tell their stories. Not all of those people are going to be existing donors. So yeah, I would say it's more about whether you have the time to actually tell a story. Cold calling, I have almost no experience with doing cold calling myself. I've received plenty of cold calls, but I'd like to think about that and get back to you, Sandra.
Great, I can give you her contact information afterwards. There's a question from Gail about how can you use stories for a portion of the market that's not developed, and the example she gives is marketing tourism in a country with low tourism rates. So maybe this is a question about sort of when there's lack of stories out there, how do you use storytelling or create stories?
Oh, another good question. Should I try answering that one now, or do we have a couple minutes left?
Yeah, go ahead.
Actually, is that person, do we have time to have that person on the line for 1 minute?
We could. I'll just let you know we have like 4 other questions.
How about,
let me answer it, and I'll see if I can find her on here.
actually, since we have so little time, let me, actually, can I just ask you to briefly run through those other questions, and we'll see if there's a common theme in there?
Sure. Another question is, are there strategies for attracting funders that you wouldn't necessarily use for general outreach? Another question is about using whiteboards and caricature for nonprofits. These are being used extensively by startups, but does it fit the NGO world? Another question is about, is there a general storytelling winning formula that you could share? So, for example, a couple years ago, Serge says it was shocking your audience. That was a major part of fundraising, successful fundraising. Is there something like that you can share about sort of today's trends and what's effective? And then one more question is from Mercy about our organization's 10-year anniversary is coming up. We want to share stories of impact in a photo essay book that people can take home. We were hoping it could also double as a marketing tool to gain future funders and members. I'd like to know if there have been any examples of these that we could draw and learn from.
Yes. Why don't I just run through a few quick thoughts, and then those people are welcome to email me afterwards. As far as whiteboards and caricature, I think they're fun. It's not always the best way of telling stories, but, it's interesting. I don't know how useful they are. I feel like, so many conferences now have those sort of illustrators taking part, and I kind of dismiss them myself, but that's not to say they're totally useless. But I just haven't seen them used as a good storytelling form per se. And as far as storytelling trends today, there was that kind of shock the viewer or reader trend a while ago, wasn't there? I mean, I've seen some interesting stories that that contradict your expectations. Maybe this is a bit like shocking or surprising, but there's the UN Development Program in Vietnam has this series of videos that flip gender roles, so that they have like these 3-minute videos of women drinking and smoking in pool halls, and while the men are at home, washing and taking care of the kids and cooking and so forth. Or there's another group that had an American woman, I guess, sneak across the street in her bathrobe and go into the forest so she could urinate. And that was a way of saying that, X number of hundreds of millions of people don't have a toilet to use. So I think there's those sort of methods. I think there's some really great community stories that are being told. Charity Water has some excellent stories about communities building wells. So that's an interesting trend for me. And I guess we're just about out of time, so I'll have to address those other questions by email. Do you want to wrap up, Sarah, or shall I just give my email? And
I just want to thank you again for joining us, Paul, and sharing your experience with us. I know there's a lot of questions and a lot of different things that you could sort of impart to our members, but I think you've given us some valuable nuggets. And for everyone who's been asking, we will send out the recording of the webinar and the slides afterwards, so stay tuned for that. And we'll also share Paul's email address for short questions that you could ask of him. So, Paul, thank you again so much, and we'll be in touch with everyone who registered soon.
All right. Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.